So I spent about 5 years writing and illustrating other books before I had time to get serious about my robot story. I had through that 5 year period, I had spent my free time kind of imagining scenes, every now and then doodling in my sketchbook a robot out in the wilderness somewhere. And some of that time I would spend reading. I was reading about robotics and artificial intelligence. I was reading about nature, animal behavior, a lot of nonfiction, but also fiction, especially science fiction. I've always loved science fiction, but I was studying science fiction to see what I could learn from like the best sci-fi that had ever been written. And I was learning so much interesting stuff about real robots, about fictitious robots, about nature, the things that the surprising things that they might have in common and their obvious differences between all of these subjects. I was learning so much interesting stuff that I realized that this robot story I was working on was going to be my first novel, not a picture book. It was going to be my first novel for kids because the story was bigger than what I was used to writing. The themes were I don't know, big themes, big ideas, big story compared to what I had written. This was my first novel for kids. So I started reading great novels for kids, including one of my favorite books, Hatchet by Gary Paulson, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And it's about a boy who finds himself stranded in the wilderness and he has to figure out how to survive all by himself. It's a survival story. And that got me thinking about my robot story. And I thought, well, maybe it'd be interesting if this was a robot survival story, the story of a robot struggling to survive in the wilderness. That sounds pretty exciting to me. So that's what I set out to do. The story turned into a lot more than that. But in the beginning, I set out to write a robot survival story. And the question, the question that kind of came to my mind immediately was like, well, what happens to a robot alone in the wilderness? If Roz is alone in the wilderness, the way Brian is alone in Hatchet, she has to figure out how to survive all by herself. Like, how does that work? A million things can happen. And so I started by just getting to know the robot character. So I invented this character, Roz the robot. And one of the first things I had to do is figure out, what does Roz look like? And I just began imagining these simple little designs for a robot character. Because the truth is that robots can look like just about anything. Here are two well-known robotic characters from the movies. C-3PO on the left looks kind of like a person with a head and a body and arms and legs. And R2-D2 on the right looks a little bit more like, I don't know, a trash can on wheels. I love R2-D2, but he's reminiscent of a trash can. I went to laboratories to meet with real scientists who were building real robots that looked like all sorts of crazy things. I saw real robots that looked like spiders, that looked like dogs, that look like submarines. The truth is, a robot can look like anything. And I had some tough decisions to make. I ended up making my character, Roz, pretty simple. This is the finished design I came up with. And simple to me was good. I wanted people to know this was a robot. In a way, I wanted her to look kind of generic, as crazy as that sounds, because when people looked at the cover of the book, I didn't want there to be any question of what they saw. I wanted them to know immediately this is a robot who's out of place in the wilderness. And for that to really work, I couldn't come up with a crazy design for this robot, because then they'd stop and people might be a little confused as to what it was that they were looking at. And I didn't want any of that. So I thought simple is good. She's got arms and legs and a body and a head like we do. She can do a lot of the same things we can do, so we can kind of relate to her. We can put ourselves in her shoes. And so those were some of the thoughts that went into my character design. I started thinking about the setting for the story, and an island was perfect, right? I thought, all right, Roz is stranded on this island. She has no choice but to figure out how to survive. I thought like a rugged northern island, maybe off the coast of Alaska or Canada, where there'll be a diversity of plant life and animal life and terrain and weather and seasons. Seasons was really important. I wanted Roz to experience as much nature as possible. Let's put this wild robot through the ringer and see how she handles all of these difficult natural situations. And of course, there's wild animals on this wild island where Roz finds herself. But the idea that I started off with was that Roz was alone in the wilderness and had to figure out how to survive, kind of like, Robinson Crusoe, that kind of thing, or Swiss Family Robinson, but by herself. And yet I know there's going to be animals out there, but I thought, she's got to have some sort of meaningful interactions with these animals, and I wasn't quite sure how that was going to work. And then I started thinking, well, you know, robots obviously are different from people. I bet Roz doesn't have to eat food. I bet she doesn't breathe air. I bet she doesn't really sleep. I bet she doesn't even have to close her eyes at all. And so that got me thinking, I wonder what would happen if Roz were to camouflage herself, you know? Maybe she sees a stick bug or an animal that can kind of camouflage itself really well and is inspired to try that for herself. And so she camouflages herself like we see on this illustration here. And she sits down in this meadow and she doesn't move them at all for weeks, you know. And she sees every little thing that happens in that meadow for like a week, maybe a month. And she remembers it all perfectly in her computer brain. And after a while, she kind of sees patterns in the animal behavior, right? She sees the same bird fly down to the same rock and sing the same song every morning. And after a while, she can kind of predict what the animals are going to do and when they're going to do these things and why they're doing these things. And slowly but surely, all the little animal noises and movements start kind of making sense to her. And she can recreate a lot of those noises and movements. And so Roz learns to speak with the animals. And once she can have conversations with them, she can make friends, a family, but most importantly is she could learn lessons because every animal is like an expert at a certain kind of survival. And so suddenly Roz has like this whole menu of survival options and different techniques and things that she can do if she can just get to know those animals, which is harder than it seems because they're, of course, afraid of her, even though she understands and can communicate with them. Takes a while to win them over. And then she comes across a little gosling, a little baby goose. You know, she finds an orphan gosling who can't run away. In fact, he hasn't even hatched from his egg. She finds a goose egg on the forest floor, abandoned, or not abandoned. His family has been killed and he's all by himself. And Roz is partially responsible. And so she decides to pick up this egg and builds it a nest. And the next day that egg hatches. Here's a sketch I made, not the finished art, but the sketch for the scene where this gosling breaks out of his egg. And the first thing he ever sees in his whole life is his robot looking back at him, you know, and so he just figures that must be his mother. So he calls her mama. And Roz understands, and she can't abandon him now. So Roz adopts this little gosling. She names him Brightbill. There he is, a bit more grown up. And so together, Roz and Brightbill have this unusual, but really sweet and interesting family out there in the wilderness. So as you can imagine, I had a lot of ideas, you know, I was sort of overflowing with ideas, and it can be hard to figure out what to do with all of these ideas. I'm writing down notes and I'm typing things on my computer, but there comes a point in the process when I have to decide what happens first in my story, you know? What happens second? What happens third? What happens every little step of the way throughout the whole plot of my story? And I do this thing I call story mapping, you know? A lot of people do this kind of thing where I just start writing down little ideas for moments that could possibly happen in the story, and I'll circle each idea and draw an arrow from one to the next, and I do this over and over and over again. I probably spent a year of my life mapping out the story for the wild robot. You know, I can easily compare and contrast two moments that could possibly happen in the story. And maybe I decide I like one better than another. So I cross off one idea and keep moving with the other. It's sort of a messy process to explain, but I spend a lot of time making these maps, mapping out the story. And then eventually, through this process, I get such a clear understanding of the plot of every little moment in the whole story. I'll make an outline of every little moment. I turned each plot point into its own chapter. The outline had 80 plot points, and so the book has 80 chapters, which sounds like a lot, but they're short chapters. You know, like I said earlier, I was a little daunted by the idea of writing a big story, but if I just focused on one short chapter at a time, suddenly it wasn't quite so overwhelming. And so that really worked for me. And it worked for the way that I read when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid, I had a hard time with reading comprehension. I had a hard time being motivated, you know, and I remember that feeling. I still have this when I finish a chapter, how satisfying that feels, you know. And so I decided I want kids to feel that feeling all the time. Every couple of pages, they're going to get a little boost, like they accomplished something. And I love that. I think it makes a big difference. So I started typing out my story. I sent it to the publisher. They get back to me with feedback, you know, and we edit and revise, and the story gradually gets better and better. And eventually I have to start figuring out what illustrations I'm going to make. And so I start by sketching different scenes, playing around, imagining, you know, which scenes might be good to illustrate, which animals I need to make sure to show for the reader, which characters I should say, mostly animals. I spent a lot of time on the book cover. That's a big deal, of course. That's basically the movie poster for the book. You got to have a nice book cover to get people to pick up that book in the first place. So here's a couple sketches I made that I liked that kind of helped me figure out the final design that I settled on. So I sketch every scene. I send the sketches to the publisher. They start building this file that looks kind of like a book with my art in place and the words in place. Quickly, I want to walk you through how I make an illustration. The cover art for the Wild Robot is in full color, but it starts as just black shapes. Simple shapes I paint on white pieces of paper. Some shapes I'll draw with pencil. So I have all these little simple drawings and paintings on paper that I scan into my computer using a scanner. And then I just kind of collage these shapes together that I painted, that started off on paper. Now they're in my computer, and I can just start layering them together. Black, inky, blobby shapes look like clouds when you turn them white, you know? And I just start laying down different shapes. There's water at the bottom, which looks more like water when you add little wavy lines. And here's a bunch of tall triangles. And that starts looking more like a forest when I add more kind of foresty details. And here's a bunch of rocky shapes. And there's raws. You know, there's a lot of shapes that I put together to make this illustration. I'm just speeding things up because we're running out of time here. But I usually worry about the color at the end. When every little shape, when everything looks right, then I can select each shape and change its color until it looks like this. And I think about the whole jacket, book jacket, actually, you know. And there's the art just by itself. So using that same process, I make art based on all the sketches. We saw this sketch earlier. Here's the finished art. Here's a few more finished illustrations. And, you know, problem with adopting a goose for a son is they have instincts that tell them to fly south for winter. And Roz, of course, realizes that she has to let her son Brightbill follow his natural instincts. So they have to say goodbye. She watches as all the geese from the island fly south together. And then winter comes. So I finish all the art. I send all the finished illustrations to the publisher, and they replace the sketches with the final art. We get all the words just right. The pictures are just right. My job is done. The book is ready to be printed. And so they send it to a printing press. And one day the book comes out into the world. And it all started with a drawing of a robot in a tree. Now, I just want to say real quick, there's a sequel and another one. So yeah, there's a whole trilogy of Wild Robot books if you're interested. Kids seem to like all of the books. So I hope you guys will give them a shot. And yes, there's a movie that just came out, The Wild Robot by DreamWorks, which is so cool.